13 years ago, my family buried my name like it was a scandal they couldn't scrub clean. No phone calls, no Christmas cards, not even a whisper when I lost everything after my business collapsed. And then this morning, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. Thick, expensive stock, deep blue ink in handwriting I hadn't seen in over a decade. There was no return address, no note, just a wedding invitation, pressed in gold foil, with a name that made my breath catch, Veronica Elms. My sister, the same woman who sabotaged my scholarship, who once turned to me across the dinner table and said, "You're the disappointment of this family, and you always will be." My hands trembled as I flipped the card, and that's when I saw the groom's name, Charles Danton. He was the CFO of Denvin Pharma, the pharmaceutical company where I once pitched a public health initiative that could have changed my life. And the man who told me, with a slick smile and condescension that dripped like syrup, "Your projections are bold, especially for someone so young." Now he was marrying my sister. In the Astoria Grand, Portland's oldest luxury hotel, where even the napkins have a waiting list. And somehow they wanted me there. No apology. No, we've missed you. Just a glittering invitation, as if none of it had ever happened. But I knew better. My family doesn't do accidents. They do strategies, calculated moves masked as kindness. And this wasn't a welcome. It was a test, a trap. And they didn't think I'd show. But what they forgot is that I'm no longer the girl they threw out with a torn duffel bag and a bleeding heart. That girl died the night I left. The woman standing in her place, she didn't come back to forgive. She came to finish what they started. It didn't start with the wedding invitation. That was just the trigger. The real damage began long before, quiet, deliberate, and dressed in family dinners and whispered blame. I was 16 the first time I realized the truth about the people who raised me and how easily they could turn a daughter into a stranger. It was a cold Saturday morning, the kind that blanketed our home in Lakewood with a thin hush of snow when my mother's diamond necklace disappeared. I wasn't supposed to be in her room, but my sister Veronica had left her curling iron plugged in again, and I went in to switch it off. That's all I did. 10 minutes, maybe less. But by noon my father's voice thundered down the hall, and the entire house fell still as he accused me, without hesitation, of stealing it. Veronica stood nearby, arms folded neatly across her chest, tears welling on cue, saying she'd seen me leave the room and had wondered what I was doing. My mother didn't ask questions. She didn't search. She just looked at me with that sharp, flat stare and said, "I always knew you had a selfish streak." They never found the necklace. Not in my room, not anywhere. But it didn't matter. The truth was never what they needed. They needed someone to blame, and I was conveniently available. After that, the silence was louder than any punishment. No rides to school, no invitations to dinner. Veronica would walk by me in the hall with a smirk that said everything her lips never needed to. They didn't ground me. They erased me. Slowly, deliberately, and with the kind of cruelty that never raises its voice, but hollows you out from the inside. When college came, I believed it could be my reset. A fresh campus, a new name on a dorm door, a chance to rewrite the story. But the past found its way there too. It started with whispers I could never quite catch, then a roommate thrusting her phone into my hands one night, her face pale. "Is this about you?" she asked. A blog, anonymous, cold, ruthless. The real Hannah Lawn, the girl who lies, steals and plays the victim. No name attached to the author, but the voice was familiar, cut with the same blade that once sliced through family dinners. "Ask her about the necklace," it sneered. "Her family knows the truth." My stomach dropped. My inbox dried up. Group projects fell through. A professor took me aside and with a pained look said, "Perception matters, Miss Lawn." I wanted to scream, to throw my truth on the table like evidence, but I had learned something more painful than silence. People don't care what's true when they've already decided what to believe. That post cost me a research grant I'd spent months preparing for. It nearly cost me school altogether. And though I couldn't prove it, I knew it was Veronica. She didn't just want to outshine me, she needed me gone, and she was willing to use any means necessary to make sure I stayed in the shadows. I buried it. Or I thought I did. Years passed, and I built a life brick by bruised brick, pretending none of it touched me anymore. But the moment I opened that wedding envelope, everything came rushing back like it had been waiting under my skin this whole time. The wounds hadn't healed. They'd only learned to keep quiet. That night I found the old blog. I didn't expect it to still exist, but there it was. Still live, still venomous. No tears came, only fire. They never cleaned up the mess because they never thought I'd survive it long enough to return. I saved every page, every IP stamp, every timestamp and quote. This wasn't nostalgia. This was evidence. Because the girl they silenced, she didn't stay broken. She listened, she watched, she waited, and she grew teeth. The next morning, while sipping coffee and letting my anger settle into focus, I received a LinkedIn notification that made my breath hitch. Veronica Elms, my sister, was being recognized by a national health journal for groundbreaking research in sustainable nutrition. I clicked the article, more out of reflex than curiosity, and there it was. My work, word for word. The title, the methodology, the conclusion, the phrasing I had agonized over during sleepless nights in college. She had taken it all, scrubbed my name from every paragraph, and claimed it as her own. I remembered the night it disappeared from the student research drive. I had shown it to her, exhausted but proud, starving for validation. She smiled and said, "Wow, you did all this." And then, just like that, the files were gone. I had to submit a backup, half-written, full of holes. It failed. Her version won a scholarship. At the spring gala, I stood in the back as they called her name. My name wasn't even mentioned. My parents stood and clapped like they'd raised a prodigy. Someone behind me whispered, "She's just on another level." I smiled, though I was breaking inside. And when I confronted my mother, she looked at me and said, "You could learn from her." I did. I learned that some people don't fight fair and others never fight for you at all. 10 years later, I printed that LinkedIn article and slid it into a manila folder already thick with receipts, screenshots, transcripts, questionable financial reports, everything I'd gathered over the years but never dared to piece together until now. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. For me. For that girl they tried to delete. Because I hadn't imagined it. The betrayal was real. The silence was engineered. The gaslighting had a name, a date, a consequence, and I had proof. Still, I didn't send anything. Not yet. I waited. Because sometimes the smartest move isn't to set the fire, it's to let them believe they're safe, until you walk in holding the match. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind had stepped into a kind of quiet I hadn't felt in years, a stillness that didn't calm but sharpened, like the silence before a storm. My husband, Evan, was fast asleep beside me, unaware that I'd been staring at that invitation for hours, fingers running over the edges like it might bleed if I pressed hard enough. When dawn broke and the city exhaled, I did what I always do when thoughts refuse to quiet. I walked. I left our apartment in Belgrove Heights, past the corner bookstore where the owner always waves through the glass, and made my way down to the wharf market. The scent of sourdough and fresh fish hit first, followed by the faint chatter of vendors setting up shop and the metallic hiss of espresso machines waking the neighborhood. Normally that place soothes me, but not that morning. That morning, every step forward pulled me deeper into a memory I hadn't let myself touch in years. I was 16 again, wearing a hand-me-down cardigan that never quite fit, stepping into the lion's den of a family I still naively thought might choose to love me, if I just behaved a little better. It was the day the necklace vanished, the day I became invisible. But I wasn't just remembering, I was reclaiming, because now I could see it for what it was. The first chapter in a long, orchestrated campaign, not just to exclude me, but to eliminate me entirely. Back home, I pulled out my old laptop, the one I hadn't opened in years. Tucked between tax documents and expired lease forms was a folder I had forgotten I saved. Fallout. Inside were screenshots, emails, partial transcripts, bits and pieces of the chaos I'd lived through but never made sense of. There was the anonymous blog, still online, still toxic, still casting shadows long after the world had forgotten it existed. I copied every post, every tag, every traceable server ID. This wasn't about nostalgia. It was about building a timeline, a pattern, a case. And the more I gathered, the more I realized how much I had ignored in the name of survival. Veronica hadn't just plagiarized my work, she had built her entire career on it. She didn't take inspiration, she committed theft, academic and professional, without so much as a second glance. My research, the model for nutrition in underserved communities I spent 8 months refining, had been lifted piece by piece. Even the phrasing in her so-called published study matched mine. It was a mirror held up to everything I'd created. Only my reflection was nowhere to be found. But that wasn't the worst of it. While pulling files from a dusty drawer in the hallway, I stumbled across a thin envelope I had never opened, tucked behind a stack of retirement brochures and unfiled receipts. It was addressed from the firm managing my grandfather's estate. I remembered calling them in 2016, desperate for clarity after I heard rumours that the inheritance he promised me had disappeared. They never returned my call. Now I knew why. Inside the envelope was a single sentence. You are not listed as a beneficiary on file. My throat went dry. That same year, I remembered receiving an unsigned letter in the mail. Just a plain white envelope, sealed tightly, with a folded DNA report inside. The header read, Private Genetic Screening, Colby Diagnostics, 2015. And at the bottom, a phrase that still makes my blood run cold. Inconclusive maternal match. My name was listed as the subject. Veronica's? Nowhere to be found. But the maternal sample, Evelyn Elms, my mother. I sat down hard, the air seeming to thin around me. It was fake. I didn't need a lab to tell me that. But the real damage wasn't in the forgery. It was in the timing. Because 6 months after that report, my name vanished from every legal document tied to our family. The will, the trust, even the emergency contacts. It wasn't just rejection. It was erasure, signed and sealed in the ink of betrayal. I turned to Evan and said the words I hadn't let myself say aloud. She didn't just cut me out. She made sure the world forgot I was ever part of them. With his help, I started digging deeper. The clinic that ran the DNA test, Colby Diagnostics, had been dissolved 3 years ago, citing administrative issues. A deeper search revealed it was a shell company, one flagged for financial inconsistencies. One of the doctors had his license revoked for falsifying lab work. And then we found it. A bank transfer. $5,000 wired to a P.O. box just weeks before the report was issued. The sender? Evelyn Elms. The weight of it all didn't crush me. It focused me. Because when you've already been broken, nothing they do can shatter you again. That night, I opened a blank document and started typing. Not a letter, not a scream, but a declaration. Subject line, I know. The body was simple. I know about the test. I know about the lie. I'm done playing the daughter you tried to erase. Then, one final sentence, undo it, or I'll do it publicly. I didn't send it for a reaction. I sent it because the silence had lasted long enough, and for once it wouldn't be mine to carry. And just as I clicked send, I realized something I hadn't known until that moment. I wasn't chasing revenge. I was reclaiming the truth, and I was finally ready to be heard. I didn't return to be welcomed. I didn't show up to heal old wounds or give anyone the satisfaction of my forgiveness. I came back because the truth had waited long enough, and so had I. The Astoria Grand stood tall beneath a sheet of coastal fog, its marble steps gleaming like a stage too polished to reflect the blood beneath it. I hadn't set foot inside that building in over a decade, but from where I stood now, back straight, dress tailored to silent armor, heels clicking like clockwork on polished stone, I didn't feel like an intruder. I felt like an inevitability. As I walked through the lobby, no one stopped me. No one questioned my presence. The concierge offered a practiced smile, the kind you learn in expensive hospitality schools, but his eyes lingered on me just long enough to wonder if I was someone important. He wasn't wrong. The ballroom doors opened as if on cue, spilling out candlelight and chatter and 100 thinly veiled performances dressed in silk and entitlement. I stepped through them slowly, not to make a scene, but because I had nothing left to rush for. Conversations dipped, glasses froze mid-air, and I could feel it, the collective breath of a room remembering someone it had once chosen to forget. Veronica looked up from her table near the stage mid-laugh, and her expression shifted in real time, amusement fading to confusion, confusion warping into dread. Her fiancé, Charles, turned just a beat later, and I watched the colour drain from his face as recognition settled like a stone in his gut. And then there was Evelyn, my mother, seated in the centre of it all. Pearls perfect, smile mechanical, fingers wrapped around her champagne flute as if it were the last thing tethering her to control. Her face didn't crack, not exactly, but her grip tightened, and her eyes darkened in a way that told me exactly what she was thinking. She wasn't supposed to come. I didn't look away. I didn't lower my gaze. I walked through that room like it belonged to me, and in a way, it did. I had been written out of the story, but I had the original draft in my pocket. Dinner resumed, but the energy had shifted. The clinking of silverware felt nervous, uneven, like the walls themselves were waiting for something to drop. When the maid of honor rose for the toast, her voice trembled just slightly, offering saccharine platitudes about love, destiny, and resilience. I let her speak. I let the applause die down. Then, without waiting for permission, I stood. "I'd like to say a few words," I said, clear and measured, not loud, but unmistakable. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the soft hum of the chandelier's electric wiring. I lifted my glass. "To truth," I said, letting the word hang like smoke, "and to those who fake it." Every head turned. Evelyn's lips parted, but she didn't speak. Veronica's smile dropped, brittle as frost on glass. Charles shifted in his chair, his posture stiff with the kind of discomfort you can't drink your way out of. I turned toward my sister, voice calm. "Veronica," I said gently, "could you remind us where you earned your MD?" A hush fell. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I continued, opening my clutch and pulling out a thin folder. "I ask because this transcript you submitted to the National Health Advisory Board lists Pacifica University with honours, but the course codes don't match their programme. In fact, your capstone project was never submitted, and your GPA appears generously inflated." I handed the folder to Charles, who took it without protest, his eyes already scanning the pages like he didn't want to believe them, but also couldn't afford not to. He blinked hard, then looked up at her. "Is this true?" he asked, voice low like a crack beneath a frozen lake. Veronica didn't answer. Couldn't. Her mouth opened and closed once, then again, but nothing came out. "This is insane," she finally said, a small, fragile sound. "This is not the time or place." "No?" I asked, turning now to Evelyn. "Is this not the place for accountability? Because if it isn't, then I suppose neither is the will you altered, or the DNA test you faked to disinherit your own daughter." Gasps rippled. A glass shattered somewhere near the back, but I didn't flinch. I looked my mother in the eye as her mask slipped just enough for me to glimpse what was behind it. Not regret, but panic. "You've always thought silence equaled obedience," I said softly. "You taught me how to keep a straight face while burning inside. But you forgot. I learned how to weaponize it." Charles set the folder down. His voice came quieter this time, more broken than before. "I defended you," he said, not looking at Veronica. "I defended you to everyone." Veronica reached for him, but he pulled away before she could touch his sleeve. "You didn't just lie to me," he said. "You lied to everyone who ever believed in you." He walked out, and no one followed. The room, once filled with power and poise, shrank around Veronica as if the air had turned on her. The guests who once fought for a spot at her table now looked away, unsure whether to offer sympathy or distance. Evelyn stood slowly, but when she reached for her daughter, Veronica stepped back, not out of defiance, but out of fear. I didn't stay for dessert. I walked through the ballroom past every wide-eyed face, through the lobby where the concierge no longer smiled. Outside, the air was crisp, clean, touched with salt and freedom. I let it hit my skin and settle in my lungs. I had come with evidence, but I was leaving with something far rarer. Peace. My phone buzzed, a voicemail. I didn't need to listen to know who it was from. The tone would be sharp, precise, somewhere between anger and control. But I didn't care. I deleted it before it opened. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for permission to speak. I had taken the mic, and the silence that followed no longer belonged to me. I didn't expect the unraveling to come so quickly, but sometimes the weight of truth, once dislodged, moves like a landslide. Silent at first, then sudden and irreversible. It started with the email, no subject line, no introduction, just one sentence. I remember what happened at Harborview Pediatrics. Attached was a scanned incident report dated back to 2017, redacted in places, but damning nonetheless. The details were sparse but sharp. Patient, male, 9 years old. Diagnosis, mild asthma. Outcome, induced coma due to epinephrine overdose. The attending physician, Veronica Elms. No charges filed, no disciplinary action listed. The incident had been buried beneath layers of administrative silence, and someone had pulled strings to make sure it stayed that way. Beneath the report was a short, handwritten note scanned in grayscale. She shouldn't have been near that ward. I couldn't say anything then, but maybe you can now. I read it twice, my hand clenched around the edge of the kitchen counter, the other pressing the print button as if my body moved ahead of my mind. I encrypted the files, backed them up on 3 separate drives, and by noon, the evidence was in the inboxes of 3 independent watchdog outlets. Health-focused, small enough to be nimble, and brave enough to risk publishing truth that carried teeth. I didn't sign my name, I didn't need to, but I didn't stop there. That same afternoon, I composed a message to Dr. Thomas Kellner, Chief of the Residency Board at Braeburn Medical. Subject: Request for clarification. Veronica Elms reinstatement. Inside, I asked a simple question. Would the board care to explain how your top resident was reinstated without formal hearing, following a pediatric incident that left a child in a coma? Attached are documents I believe were missed in your previous review. I knew he wouldn't respond, not directly. The silence from institutions is louder than their apologies. By morning, Veronica's profile had been scrubbed from the Braeburn website. Her LinkedIn listed her as consultant, no affiliations, no title. But that was just the first fracture. The second came when I received a message from a forensic accountant my husband Evan had referred me to. A quiet man named Jared Lowell, whose calm demeanor masked a mind sharp enough to unravel decades of deception. He handed me a slim folder with the words, "Personal use only," scrawled across the front. Inside was a financial audit, clean and brutal. Wire transfers, offshore accounts, questionable reimbursements from the Elms Family Health Trust, all tagged under my name. Medical consulting fees I never received. Refunds from years I hadn't filed taxes. Equipment purchases from clinics I'd never heard of. It all led back to one fact. They hadn't just disinherited me. They had used me. While I scraped by on scholarships and night shifts, while I rationed groceries and applied for research grants I never received, my name was being used as a financial firewall, shielding fraudulent activity, protecting their wealth under the cloak of my erasure. One transaction, $42,000, was dated from the year I shared a basement apartment with mold in the ceiling and no heat in December. I didn't even have a credit card. But someone had claimed I was a paid medical consultant. They didn't just abandon me, they exploited me. And so I knew what I had to do. The Elms Foundation's annual gala was scheduled for Friday night, a black tie affair stuffed with donors, public figures, and every journalist the family had ever buttered up. I wasn't invited, of course, but I didn't need to be. I wore black, not out of mourning, but intention, and entered through the side service corridor, slipping past catering carts and wine lists, guided only by certainty. Gregory Elms, my father, was on stage, mid-speech, praising the values of integrity and community health. Veronica and Evelyn stood nearby, their smiles unshaken, framed in candlelight and public affection. I stepped onto the stage, heels firm, shoulders high, and silence fell like a sheet over the crowd. Gregory's expression faltered, Evelyn went stiff. Veronica blinked, confused for only a second before the terror arrived. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Before you donate tonight," I said, addressing no one in particular but capturing everyone at once, "you may want to know where your money's really been going." I turned to the audiovisual technician and handed him a flash drive. The screens behind us flickered, then filled with spreadsheets, wire logs, emails, each one bearing my name. One slide read, "Rowena Lawn, medical consultant." Beneath it, a digital signature, G. Elms. A wave of murmurs surged through the ballroom. I could feel people shifting in their seats, unsure if they should look away or lean in. Gregory reached for the mic, stammering that the documents must have been doctored, that this was a misunderstanding. But then Jared stepped forward from the back of the room, suit pressed, expression unreadable, and spoke with quiet finality. Our firm submitted these files directly to the IRS and the State Attorney General's office. The room collapsed into chaos. Donors stood. Journalists raised their phones. Desmond, Veronica's now former fiancé, approached from the side, documents in hand, voice steel-cut as he added, "And I've already forwarded mine to the medical board. I won't support liars any longer." Evelyn tried to speak, but Veronica pulled away from her grip, her eyes wide, mascara streaking. "You dragged me into this," she hissed. "You said it would never come back." But it had, and it had come with receipts. I didn't linger. I didn't bask. I simply walked off that stage and out of the building, leaving the wreckage behind me, not with triumph but with release. Because I hadn't come for vengeance. I came for truth. And once it was spoken, they destroyed themselves with it. The silence that followed wasn't the kind that came after destruction. It was the kind that follows survival. 2 weeks after the gala, my world was still, but for the first time in years, it wasn't the stillness of waiting for something else to fall apart. It was the kind of quiet that settles after the storm has finally spent itself, when the air feels clean again, and the only sound is your own breath finding its natural rhythm. I woke up to morning sunlight pouring across the hardwood floors of our apartment, soft and warm like a promise I hadn't dared to believe in. Evan was already up, reading on the balcony, his coffee steaming beside him. There were no missed calls, no headlines, no legal threats, just air, open and unburdened. For years, I had lived in a kind of emotional crouch, always bracing for the next blow, the next manipulation, the next quiet erasure of my worth. Now that reflex was gone. And in its place was something unfamiliar but deeply welcome. Peace, not the kind that arrives with fireworks or final victories, but the kind that simply settles, like dust after movement, like truth after noise. I didn't check the voicemail until that afternoon, though I had seen the notifications sitting there for days. I already knew whose voice I'd hear. Evelyn's tone was exactly as I expected. Tight, clipped, carefully composed rage dressed as concern. "You've humiliated this family," she said, her voice brittle. "You'll regret what you've done." But it wasn't the threat that stayed with me. It was the last few seconds, when her voice faltered just enough to sound almost like pain, almost, but not enough to be real. And even if it had been, it no longer mattered. I deleted the message without saving it. Veronica never called, not even a hollow apology or a blame-filled plea. She vanished, quietly, strategically, her social media wiped, her name no longer attached to any institution or clinic. Desmond sent one text. "I didn't know." "I'm sorry." I looked at it for a long while before replying, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity. "I believe you, but I don't need anything from you anymore." And I meant it. Because healing, I've learned, isn't a dramatic moment. It's a series of quiet choices. The choice to stop chasing closure. The choice to stop rehearsing old arguments in your head. The choice to stop proving your worth to people who were never looking for it. Gregory's medical license was suspended. The Foundation's accounts were frozen, and the IRS launched a full investigation that would likely take years to unravel. Evelyn disappeared from public life, her usual calendar of speaking engagements and charity appearances replaced by a long silence. No press releases, no interviews, no explanations. They scattered like leaves in wind they could no longer control. And me? I kept moving forward. That evening, I walked into my office for the first time since everything came to light. My team looked at me with something I hadn't seen in a long time: respect without fear, warmth without pity. They didn't ask questions they didn't need to. They simply welcomed me back as though I had never left myself behind. Later that night, Miriam, my very first supervisor from years ago, the woman who handed me a mop and a warm sandwich when I was 17 and homeless, showed up at my door with a bouquet of sunflowers. Her voice cracked as she said, "You made it out." And all I could do was nod and whisper. There wasn't any air left in there. Evan reached across the dinner table, took my hand, and held it the way he always had, not to fix me, not to save me, but just to remind me that I had always been whole. "You did what no one else could," he said quietly. "You gave them every chance to choose love, and when they didn't, you didn't go down with them." There was nothing left to say, only the kind of understanding that doesn't need words. Because I had spent so many years believing that justice had to look like punishment, that freedom had to come through confrontation, that healing had to be loud and final and witness to be real. But maybe it doesn't. Maybe it just looks like waking up without fear, like breathing deeply in your own home, like knowing you no longer have to convince anyone of your story. They may never apologize. They may never say my name with softness again. But I no longer need them to, because I am free. And that, more than revenge, more than victory, is what healing truly feels like. Sometimes I wonder what might have happened if I had stayed quiet, if I had chosen peace at the expense of truth, if I had smiled through one more lie just to keep the illusion intact, if I had let them continue rewriting my story while I sat silently on the margins of my own life. But then I remember how heavy that silence was, how it settled in my chest like stone, how it made even the simplest joys feel borrowed, how it convinced me that survival meant shrinking. And I know now that I didn't come this far just to be quiet again. If you've made it to this point, maybe something in my story felt familiar. Not the details necessarily, but the ache, the confusion, the way you start to question your own memory when the people who claim to love you refuse to see you. Maybe you've been told that your pain was an exaggeration, that your truth was too inconvenient, too disruptive, too bitter for polite company. And maybe you've spent years trying to earn love from people who only ever wanted obedience. If that's you, I want you to hear this. You are not too much. You are not imagining it. You are not alone. You do not owe your silence to those who discarded you. You do not have to protect the people who never once protected you, and you do not need their apology in order to begin healing. Because sometimes closure doesn't come wrapped in an apology or delivered with regret. Sometimes it looks like choosing to walk away, not because you're weak, but because your peace is no longer up for negotiation. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is live in a truth no one ever gave you permission to speak. They may never say, "I'm sorry." They may never admit what they did. They may continue to rewrite the story to suit themselves. But if you're still here, still breathing, still building, still rising, then you've already done something they never expected. You've survived. And now you get to choose what happens next. You get to stop performing. You get to stop explaining. You get to take up space in your own life. And if my story helped you remember even a piece of your own, if it lit a small spark somewhere inside that's been waiting to burn, then I hope you carry that fire forward. Not to scorch, but to illuminate, to make space, to speak not just for revenge, but for release. Because forgiveness is a gift, but freedom is yours by right, and you are allowed to live like it. If you've ever walked away from a family who made you feel invisible, or you're still trying to find the courage to speak after years of silence, I'd love to hear your story. Drop a comment below, tell me where you're watching from, or simply type 1 if this story found its way to the right heart tonight. And if it didn't speak to you, if it missed the mark, I still welcome your voice, because we grow by listening, and every truth deserves to be heard. If this story stayed with you, I hope you'll subscribe, share it with someone who needs to know they're not alone, and join me for more true stories about survival, justice, and finding your voice after the world tried to take it. Because sometimes one story is all it takes to remember. We still get to write our own .de.